December 10, 1944, Lanzerath, Belgium. A hard winter had settled over the Ardennes. Snow blanketed the fields, and the ground had frozen solid beneath the boots of American soldiers. On a narrow ridge overlooking the quiet village of Lanzerath, First Lieutenant Lyle Boak carefully examined the terrain that would soon determine the fate of his platoon. Only 20 years old, Boak was among the youngest commissioned officers serving in the U.S. Army. His rank was new, but the responsibility it carried was immense. Before him stretched open farmland leading toward the German frontier, ground that, if breached, would open a path deep into Allied rear areas. Orders had just arrived, and they were unmistakable in their gravity. 18 men from the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment were to hold this position at all costs. What none of them could possibly foresee was the scale of what lay ahead. In less than a week, this small group of soldiers would slow the advance of an entire SS Panzer division for nearly a full day, a delay that would ripple through the German timetable, disrupt Adolf Hitler's final offensive in the Ardennes, and influence the outcome of what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. At that moment, however, only one certainty existed: a German attack was coming. The timing was the only unknown. Lyle Boak's journey to that frozen ridge had begun far from Europe, in a very different America. He was raised in St. Louis during the darkest years of the Great Depression. His family lived modestly, often moving from place to place, surviving in cramped houses that lacked basic comforts such as electricity or indoor plumbing. Poverty was a constant presence. At just 14 years old, determined to ease the burden on his parents and help support his 4 younger siblings, Boak walked into a National Guard recruitment office. No one questioned his age. He enlisted in the headquarters company of the Missouri 138th Infantry Regiment and became a soldier for $1 a day on drill weekends. By the age of 16, Boak had already advanced to the position of supply sergeant. The income he earned exceeded what many of his peers made in civilian jobs, and much of it went directly back to his family. The discipline, hardship, and responsibility of those early years shaped him deeply, forging a level of toughness and self-reliance that would later prove decisive under fire. When the 35th Infantry Division was called into federal service on December 23, 1940, Boak continued his rise through the ranks. He took part in the massive Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, the largest military training exercise in U.S. history at the time. Serving as transportation sergeant for the regimental headquarters, he distinguished himself through efficiency, leadership, and calm under pressure. Senior officers took notice. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the global situation overnight. With the United States now fully committed to the war, Boak volunteered for officer candidate school. He arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he endured 4 demanding months of intensive training designed to turn experienced enlisted men into combat leaders. On August 25, 1942, he graduated near the top of his class, 4th out of 57 candidates. His performance earned him an assignment as an instructor, teaching small unit defensive tactics to new officer candidates. For an entire year, he passed on lessons about terrain, fire discipline, and defensive positioning, principles that would soon be tested in the harshest possible conditions. Eventually, Boak was transferred to the newly formed 99th Infantry Division and prepared for overseas deployment. In early November 1944, the division arrived at Le Havre, France. These were inexperienced troops, fresh to the European theatre, and they entered what appeared to be a quiet sector of the front. By then, the Allied advance seemed unstoppable. Since D-Day, German forces had been driven steadily eastward. Paris had been liberated in August, Brussels in September, and Antwerp soon afterward. Confidence was high. The Ardennes, dense with forests and broken terrain, was viewed as a low-risk area, ideal for acclimating new divisions before heavier combat. In mid-November, the 99th Infantry Division replaced the battle-hardened 60th Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division in the Ardennes sector. The front was strangely calm. Patrols encountered little resistance. Artillery was silent. To experienced eyes, the stillness felt unsettling. It was during this period that Lyle Boak assumed command of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon attached to the 394th Infantry Regiment. The unit was small but highly selective. Its soldiers were chosen for exceptional marksmanship, endurance, and mental toughness. Several had been university students originally trained under the Army Specialized Training Program before being reassigned as infantry replacements. Under normal conditions, the platoon numbered 25 men, organized into two 9-man reconnaissance squads and a 7-man headquarters section. Their mission was among the most dangerous in the regiment, conducting deep patrols toward and beyond enemy lines, capturing prisoners for intelligence, locating German positions, and providing real-time information to regimental command. Now, on a frozen Belgian ridge overlooking Lanzerath, that mission was about to change. Instead of observing the enemy, Boak and his men were about to become the obstacles standing directly in the path of Germany's last major offensive in the West. History was moving toward them fast. They had never been intended for prolonged, direct engagement with enemy forces. Their purpose was reconnaissance. They were soldiers trained to observe, infiltrate, collect intelligence, and withdraw without being seen, uniformed scouts operating in silence rather than shock assaults. In the weeks that followed their arrival, the platoon carried out a series of hazardous missions deep inside enemy-controlled territory. Observation posts were established in exposed locations, and patrols moved cautiously through frozen landscapes clogged with snow and veiled by dense fog. At times, they advanced as far as Lochheim, nearly 2 miles beyond German defensive positions. These incursions were not merely for surveillance. On several occasions, they captured enemy troops and escorted them back across the lines for questioning. The missions were nerve-wracking, pushing the men to the limits of endurance and discipline. Yet their contribution proved invaluable. Boo and several members of his unit were among the earliest in the regiment to be awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge, recognition reserved for soldiers who demonstrated exceptional performance under fire. Despite the constant danger, losses had remained minimal. Opposing German units appeared passive, content to hold defensive positions along the Siegfried Line with little effort to challenge American patrols. Intelligence assessments reinforced this perception. Reports suggested that German forces in the sector were worn down after years of sustained warfare on multiple fronts and lacked the strength for major offensive action. That assumption would soon prove catastrophically wrong. On December 10, Major Robert Chris, the commanding officer of the 394th Infantry Regiment, summoned Lieutenant Book to regimental headquarters. New orders were issued without delay. Book's platoon was to redeploy immediately to an area near the village of Lanzerath, roughly 6 miles southeast of their current location near Hunningen. Lanzerath was scarcely more than a crossroads, a hamlet of 23 houses and a small church, but its location made it strategically vital. It sat at a key junction on the northern edge of the Lochheim Gap, a narrow corridor between the 99th Infantry Division to the north and the 106th Infantry Division to the south. This gap represented a serious weakness in the American defensive line, one that enemy forces could exploit if left unguarded. Recent intelligence had detected heightened German movement in the area. Book's platoon was tasked with sealing the gap and serving as an early warning screen against any enemy advance. Should German units break through Lanzerath, the road network beyond the village would grant them rapid access to the American rear, threatening to outflank the lightly deployed divisions holding the sector. As Book examined his maps, the gravity of the assignment became unmistakable. His unit, officially authorized for 25 men, was operating with only 18. Several soldiers had been reassigned to regimental duties, leaving the platoon severely under strength, yet these 18 men were expected to hold a gap spanning several miles. The nearest reserve, a battalion from the same regiment, was positioned miles behind them at Buchholz Station. If German forces attacked in significant numbers, help would not arrive quickly, if at all. The situation was further complicated by the patchwork nature of the defense. Book's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon was attached to Task Force X, a small detachment from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion. This force consisted of approximately 55 men and 4 towed 3-inch anti-tank guns. In addition, a separate reconnaissance element from the same battalion, 22 men equipped with an armored half-track and 2 jeeps, was stationed directly inside Lanzerath. On paper, the combined strength appeared adequate. In practice, the units had no shared training, no established coordination, and no unified command structure, factors that would severely limit their effectiveness under pressure. The platoon reached Lanzerath on December 10 and immediately began preparing defensive positions. Book chose a wooded ridgeline northwest of the village, a natural vantage point overlooking an open, gently sloping field that descended toward the main road approaching from the east. The terrain offered clear lines of fire across exposed ground, ideal for ambush and defense. Foxholes were dug along the edge of the forest, carefully spaced to allow overlapping fields of fire. Each position was concealed with camouflage and reinforced with overhead protection to reduce vulnerability to artillery and mortar fire. Fresh snowfall worked in their favor, blending the earthworks into the surrounding terrain until they were nearly invisible from below. Weapons were emplaced with deliberate precision. Light machine guns were positioned to cover the primary avenues of approach. Barr had personally acquired a jeep-mounted .50 caliber heavy machine gun, a formidable asset capable of inflicting devastating damage at long range. This weapon was placed in a defilated position, allowing it to interdict enemy movement from the south while remaining shielded from direct fire. The platoon established a designated kill zone by sighting all weapons on a fence line roughly 100 yards out in the field. Makeshift alarm systems, tripwires connected to empty cans filled with stones, were strung through the surrounding woods to warn of infiltration attempts after dark. Communications were established with battalion headquarters at Loschimmergraben via field telephone, while radio contact was maintained with regimental headquarters at Hunningen. Patrols moved into Lanzerath to coordinate defensive plans with Task Force X and the reconnaissance unit stationed there. Once preparations were complete, the men settled into their frozen positions. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and a relentless wind swept across the ridge, punctuated by steady snowfall. 4 to 5 inches of snow accumulated, further concealing their foxholes. The cold was merciless, but discipline and routine carried them through. Most of the soldiers were barely out of adolescence, teenagers or young men in their early 20s, thousands of miles from home, defending a remote ridge in Belgium that few had ever heard of before the war. For 5 days, nothing happened. They observed, listened, and waited. Then the signs began to change. German activity beyond the border increased noticeably. On the night of December 15, the low rumble of vehicles could be heard moving east of their positions under cover of darkness. Reports from neighboring units described unusual enemy movements and large formations assembling behind the Siegfried Line. American intelligence noted these developments but misread their significance. Commanders believed the Germans were preparing defensive measures in response to ongoing Allied operations toward the Roa River dams to the north. A large-scale German offensive was considered unlikely. In the prevailing assessment, the Wehrmacht was a spent force, exhausted, undersupplied, and incapable of major action. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, that illusion was obliterated. Across an 80-mile front, more than 1,600 German artillery guns opened fire simultaneously. The earth shook as shells slammed into American positions, command posts, and communication lines. The bombardment marked the opening phase of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's final, desperate gamble on the Western Front. The plan was audacious in scope. German forces were to rupture the Allied lines in the Ardennes, drive westward to the Meuse River, seize the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and compel a negotiated peace. Success would allow Germany to redirect its remaining strength against the advancing Soviet forces in the east. To execute this plan, Hitler committed his last strategic reserves. 3 full armies, including elite SS panzer divisions that had been rebuilt and re-equipped, were unleashed against what German planners believed was the weakest section of the American line held by relatively inexperienced troops. The artillery barrage continued for 90 relentless minutes. When it finally lifted, the Battle of the Bulge had begun. As artillery shells detonated throughout the forest, the soldiers of B's platoon remained crouched inside their foxholes along the ridge. Explosions tore through the treetops, snapping branches and sending splinters raining down. Shock waves from shells landing nearby slammed into their bodies while the frozen earth trembled under each blast. Despite the violence of the bombardment, the effects were limited. The defensive positions had been carefully prepared and well concealed, and the German gunners were firing without accurate targeting data. Unable to identify the precise location of the American foxholes, the barrage failed to neutralize the platoon. When the shelling stopped shortly after 7 a.m., the men cautiously rose from their positions. They were shaken and disoriented, but none had been injured. Communication by field telephone had been cut, yet their radio remained operational. As daylight spread across the snow-covered terrain, the situation took a sudden and alarming turn. From their vantage point, the platoon observed Task Force X withdrawing from the village of Lanzerath. The tank destroyers and reconnaissance elements, previously their only meaningful support, pulled back without warning or explanation. No message was sent to Lieutenant Book. With their departure, B's platoon was left isolated, now standing alone as the final American force positioned between the German border and the rear areas of the 99th Infantry Division. In the early morning haze, Book noticed movement to the east. Shapes emerged through the mist-organized formations, growing in number. It quickly became clear that these were not small patrols. Hundreds of enemy troops were assembling, far exceeding anything indicated in prior intelligence reports. Book immediately contacted regimental headquarters by radio and requested authorization to pull back. His proposal was to conduct a controlled fighting withdrawal, slowing the enemy advance while preserving his platoon. The response was swift and definitive. He was ordered to stay where he was. Reinforcements from the 3rd Battalion were reportedly on the way. His instructions were clear: hold the position at all costs. At roughly 8 a.m., 3 members of the platoon, Sergeant William Slate, Private James Silva, and Technician 5th Grade Sam Jenkins, moved downhill to establish an observation post inside a house on the eastern edge of Lanzerath that had recently been vacated by Task Force X. Book went with them to personally evaluate the developing threat. What he witnessed was deeply unsettling. Advancing from the direction of Loschheim was a long, compact column of German troops, numbering close to 500 men. Their distinctive helmets immediately identified them as Fallschirmjäger German paratroopers drawn from some of the most capable formations still available to the Wehrmacht. These were not poorly trained or demoralized units. They were experienced combat soldiers moving with coordination, discipline, and confidence. They believed they were about to exploit a clean rupture in American defenses. Book and the observation team hurried back to the ridge to warn the platoon. The numbers were stark, approximately 500 German paratroopers facing just 18 American soldiers. The imbalance was extreme, nearly 28-1. Every principle Book had learned as an officer told him that withdrawal was the only rational course of action. But his orders left no room for interpretation. The platoon was to remain in place. The German column entered Lanzerath and began moving through the village. At some point, an elderly Belgian woman approached a group of German officers gathered near a cafe. She spoke to them while pointing toward the ridge where the American positions were hidden. Whether her actions were deliberate or motivated by fear and a desire to spare her village remains uncertain. What is known is that the information reached the German commander. Acting on this intelligence, he quickly reorganized his battalion and prepared an assault against the ridge. Around 10 a.m., the first German assault element emerged from Lanzerath and began climbing the open, snow-covered slope toward the American line. The attackers advanced using standard infantry assault doctrine, spread across the terrain in extended formation with weapons ready. The sunlight reflecting off the fresh snow illuminated the field clearly. While the Germans could see the tree line ahead, they had no precise knowledge of where the American foxholes were located. Expecting minimal resistance, they moved forward steadily. From their concealed positions, Book and his men watched and waited. No shots were fired. Weapons remained trained on a fence line the platoon had carefully ranged days earlier. The German soldiers crossed the fence and continued uphill 100 yards, then 90, then 80. When they reached approximately 75 yards, Book gave the order. The ridge erupted in gunfire. 2 .30-caliber machine guns opened simultaneously, their overlapping fields of fire sweeping the slope. MUN rifles cracked in rapid succession as skilled riflemen selected and engaged targets with lethal accuracy. The effect was immediate and devastating. German paratroopers dropped where they stood, struck down before they could react. The fence line instantly became a deadly trap. Those who attempted to take cover behind it found it offered no protection from rifle fire. Moments later, the .50 caliber machine gun joined the engagement. Its heavy rounds tore through formations, capable of striking multiple men with a single burst. The weapon's thunderous report echoed across the valley, unmistakable and overwhelming. The first assault collapsed within minutes. Survivors fled back toward Lanzerath, leaving the slope littered with dead and wounded. Remarkably, the American platoon suffered no losses. The ambush had been total and unexpected. The German battalion commander surveyed the aftermath and drew a logical but incorrect conclusion. Based on the volume and effectiveness of the fire, he assumed he had encountered a much larger American force, possibly an entire infantry company supported by heavy weapons. He decided that any renewed attack would require additional preparation. German artillery and mortars began pounding the ridge as the battalion reorganized. Shortly after midday, a second assault was launched. This time, the German troops advanced more cautiously, using terrain features for cover and laying down suppressive fire as they moved. Once again, the American defenses came alive. Machine guns swept back and forth across the attackers. Riflemen engaged individual targets with disciplined precision. The .50 caliber machine gun focused on clusters of German soldiers attempting to regroup for another rush. For a second time, the assault failed. Casualties mounted rapidly. The snow-covered slope became stained with blood, and bodies remained scattered across the field, silent evidence of the effectiveness of the American defense and the exceptional marksmanship of the platoon. Against overwhelming odds, a single, isolated American unit had halted the advance of an elite German battalion, at least for the moment. The German forces disengaged once more, but this withdrawal did not signal a pause in the fighting. Instead, they sustained constant pressure through coordinated and relentless fire. Machine gun teams deployed around Lanzerath directed sweeping bursts toward the American-held tree line, raking the defensive line without interruption. At the same time, mortar crews continued their bombardment, dropping rounds with the clear intent of silencing or annihilating the defenders. Inside the American perimeter, conditions were rapidly deteriorating. Ammunition supplies were shrinking at a dangerous pace, and several soldiers had already been injured by flying shrapnel. With each renewed attack, the Germans gained a better understanding of the American defensive layout. The longer the fight dragged on, the more certain it became that the flanks would eventually be exposed, allowing the position to be surrounded. Recognizing the growing danger, Lieutenant Buck once again contacted regimental headquarters. He delivered a grim assessment of the situation and urgently requested authorization to pull back before his unit was completely encircled. As before, the response was short and unequivocal. The platoon was to remain where it was. Reinforcements, he was told, were on the way. Shortly after 2 p.m., the Germans initiated their third large-scale assault of the day. This attack was notably stronger than the previous ones, with additional troops committed and a level of determination that left no doubt about their intent. American soldiers responded with everything they had left, pouring rifle and machine gun fire into the advancing enemy. Yet, the sheer number of attackers was beginning to overwhelm the defenders. During this phase of the fighting, Private Billy Queen, one of 4 forward artillery observers attached to the platoon, was manning a forward position when he was struck by a bullet in the abdomen. He cried out and fell. With no medic present and no surgical tools available, his fellow soldiers could do little more than ease his suffering. He succumbed to his wounds within minutes, becoming the only American killed during the day's fighting. As the assault intensified, Sergeant William Slate took control of the .50 caliber machine gun. From his position, he unleashed sustained fire into the dense German formations advancing across open ground. The weapon shuddered violently with each burst, and Slate continued firing without pause. The barrel soon overheated to the point that it glowed visibly. Eventually, the extreme heat caused rounds to detonate prematurely inside the chamber, and moments later the barrel warped, rendering the gun inoperable. At the most critical moment of the battle, the platoon lost its most powerful weapon. Despite this setback, the third German assault also failed. Once again, the attacking paratroopers fell back, leaving behind even greater losses than before. The ground in front of the American foxholes was now littered with German casualties, both dead and wounded. For the German battalion commander, the situation had become dire. His unit had suffered no fewer than 92 confirmed casualties, a level of loss that severely crippled its combat effectiveness. His mission had been to clear the route hours earlier, enabling follow-on units to exploit the advance. Instead, his forces were stalled by what he continued to believe was a substantial American formation. Concluding that further frontal attacks would only worsen his losses, he ordered a shift in tactics. Sustained suppressive fire would continue while probing elements searched for weaknesses along the American flanks. As evening drew near, the American position was on the verge of collapse. The men had been engaged in continuous combat for nearly 10 hours without relief. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Most of the platoon had suffered wounds of varying severity. Contacts with higher headquarters had been lost, and the .50 caliber machine gun was permanently disabled. Meanwhile, German troops had abandoned direct assaults and were now maneuvering to encircle the position. With dusk approaching, German paratroopers finally succeeded in infiltrating around both flanks. Groups numbering roughly 50 soldiers pushed into the perimeter from several directions at once. In some foxholes, the fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans advanced methodically, clearing each position one after another. During the final moments, a German soldier fired into Lieutenant Buck's foxhole, striking the man beside him in the leg and inflicting serious injuries. Buck was then taken prisoner at gunpoint. Within a matter of minutes, the entire platoon had been overwhelmed. 15 American soldiers were captured on the spot. 2 others, Privates Jenkins and Preston, were not present, having been sent earlier in the day to regimental headquarters in a final attempt to secure reinforcements. By the following morning, their fate was sealed. The remaining defenders would be taken prisoner. Earlier in the fight, 3 soldiers, Robinson, McGeehan, and Silva, had become separated from the rest of the unit. Moving cautiously through the chaos, they managed to break contact and make their way toward Losheimer Graben, eventually slipping back into American-controlled territory. With that, the fighting at Lanzerath Ridge came to an end. What had occurred there was extraordinary. A small intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, just 18 American soldiers supported by 4 forward artillery observers, had stood their ground against a full German parachute battalion numbering roughly 500 men. For nearly an entire day, they resisted repeated assaults, inflicting at least 92 confirmed casualties. In return, they suffered 1 man killed and 14 wounded before being overrun. Yet the true impact of their stand could not be measured by casualty figures alone. Their resistance delayed the German advance in the northern sector by almost 20 hours, a pause that would ripple through the entire Ardennes offensive. After their capture, the wounded Americans were gathered in the village of Lanzerath. German medics established improvised aid stations inside local homes and treated the prisoners' injuries. As night fell, the consequences of the day's battle began to emerge. The German 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, battered and exhausted from its struggle against what it believed to be a much larger force, made no attempt to continue its advance after dark. Losses had been heavy, morale shaken, and the regimental commander feared that the forest beyond Lanzerath concealed additional American troops, possibly even armored units. Rather than risk a nighttime push into the unknown, the decision was made to halt, reorganize, and wait for daylight. That moment of caution would prove decisive. Close to midnight, nearly 12 hours behind schedule, a column of German armored vehicles finally reached Lanzerath. This force was Kampfgruppe Piper, the most powerful and critical armored spearhead in the entire German offensive. It was commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper and consisted of approximately 4,800 men and nearly 800 vehicles, including 117 tanks. Among them were Tiger and King Tiger heavy tanks, some of the most formidable armored vehicles of the war. Paper's assignment was central to the success of the operation. His battle group was expected to drive rapidly westward, seize the bridges over the Meuse River, and hold them open for the follow-on forces. Speed was essential. The operational timetable required him to reach the Meuse on the very first day. Instead, Piper found his route blocked by a demoralized parachute regiment that had spent the entire day locked in combat with what was, in reality, a platoon-sized American force. Enraged, Piper confronted Colonel Hans von Hoffmann, the commander of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. The argument, heated in public, was witnessed by American prisoners nearby. Piper demanded answers. Why had the regiment stopped? Why had the road not been cleared? Why had no reconnaissance been conducted beyond Lanzerath to determine whether additional American units were present? Though Hoffmann technically held a higher formal rank, he was outranked in practice by the SS officer. He attempted to justify his decisions, explaining that his regiment had suffered serious losses, that the American resistance had been far stronger than anticipated, and that his exhausted men needed time to regroup. Piper was unconvinced. Taking matters into his own hands, he led a reconnaissance patrol forward with his own troops. What he discovered was infuriating. The woods beyond Lanzerath were empty. There were no additional American forces, no tanks, no prepared defenses. The entire German advance had been delayed for nearly a full day by just 18 American soldiers. By the time Kampfgruppe Pieper resumed its movement, it was already 4:30 a.m. On December 17, more than 18 hours behind schedule. That delay would have devastating consequences. The German offensive depended on strict timing and precise coordination. Any disruption created bottlenecks on the narrow Ardennes roads, causing traffic jams as follow-on units piled up behind stalled formations. Meanwhile, American commanders, initially caught off guard by the attack, used the precious time bought by small delaying actions like the stand at Lanzerath to rush reinforcements into threatened areas. Units from the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions, elements of the 7th Armored Division, and later the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were moved into blocking positions across the German advance routes. When Pieper finally broke free and pushed westward toward the Meuse, he encountered increasingly stiff resistance. In the early days, Kampfgruppe Pieper achieved notable tactical successes. American positions at Honsfeld and Bullingen were overrun, and vital fuel supplies were captured, fuel the Germans desperately needed. However, on December 17, near the Bauernese crossroads, elements of Pieper's command committed one of the most infamous war crimes of the conflict, murdering approximately 84 American prisoners of war in what would later be known as the Malmedy Massacre. Despite this, the battle group continued its advance. On December 18, Pieper's forces crossed the Amblieve River near Stavelot, pushing deeper into American-held territory. For a brief moment, it appeared that the German spearhead might still achieve its objective. But the earlier delay had already shifted the balance. American forces closed in from multiple directions. Units from the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 3rd Armored Division converged along Pieper's route. Bridges were destroyed ahead of the advancing Germans, forcing time-consuming detours. American tank destroyers ambushed German columns along narrow roads. As the weather cleared, Allied fighter bombers grounded on December 16 returned to the skies and relentlessly attacked exposed German armor. By December 22, Kampfgruppe Pieper was trapped in the village of Le Glis. Cut off from resupply, nearly out of fuel and ammunition, and surrounded by American forces, the once powerful battle group was effectively finished. Of the original 4,800 men and 117 tanks, only around 800 soldiers remained, and none of the armor was operational. On the night of December 23, Pieper ordered his surviving troops to abandon all vehicles and heavy equipment and escape on foot back toward German lines. More than 100 vehicles were left behind, including 6 King Tiger tanks abandoned in and around Le Glis. The armored spearhead of the German 6th Panzer Army had been stopped. The breakthrough, intended to drive all the way to Antwerp, failed to even reach the Meuse River. The meticulously planned timetable of the offensive, fatally disrupted on its very first day by a handful of American soldiers on a frozen ridge, never recovered. For the captured members of the American Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, a different ordeal was just beginning. Those who were able to walk were marched eastward toward Germany in brutal winter conditions. 2 men who were too seriously wounded to move were left behind in German field hospitals. After 2 days of forced marching through intense cold, the prisoners were loaded into railroad boxcars in the village of Junkerath. Private William Book later found himself packed into a single cattle car with 71 other American prisoners. They traveled for days without food or water. By Christmas Day, 7 men in Book's car had died and the survivors were barely alive. Eventually, the remaining prisoners were transferred to hospitals in Frankfurt and Hanover to receive treatment for their wounds. From there, they were sent to prisoner of war camps, where they would remain for the next 5 months until Allied forces liberated them in April 1945. Lieutenant Book initially regarded December 16th as an unmitigated failure. His units had been overrun by enemy forces, the majority of his men were wounded, and all were captured. The objective to maintain control of their assigned position had ended in complete loss. At the time, he had no way of knowing that the platoon under his command had actually achieved a result of far greater strategic importance than merely defending ground. During the first chaotic days of the offensive, disrupted communications prevented American commanders from realizing the significance of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon's actions. In the confusion of the broader Battle of the Bulge, the platoon's efforts went largely unnoticed. After the war, when the surviving prisoners were finally liberated, most of the men simply wanted to return home. They were exhausted, both physically and psychologically, having endured wounds, starvation, and months of captivity in disease-ridden prison camps. Seeking recognition was the furthest thing from their minds. It was only with the passage of time that the full importance of the engagement at Lanzerath Ridge became apparent. Historians, scrutinizing post-war German operational reports, discovered that the platoon's resistance had delayed the 12th SS Panzer Division for 18 critical hours. This disruption significantly altered the timeline of the German offensive. The 12th SS had been tasked with breaking the 99th Infantry Division, reinforced by additional units. However, the delay at Lanzerath allowed American forces to establish and fortify defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge, ultimately preventing the German army from achieving its intended breakthrough. The inability of the Germans to capture Elsenborn Ridge turned the northern sector of the Battle of the Bulge into a major obstacle, hindering the entire offensive. Had the initial objectives been met on schedule, German forces might have overrun large American supply depots near Leven and Spa, potentially altering the entire course of the campaign. Slowly, the men of the platoon came to understand the impact of their actions. In June 1966, Lieutenant Book was astonished to receive a Silver Star in the mail, awarded quietly without ceremony or explanation. No other members of the platoon were recognized at that time, an omission that deeply frustrated Book. Not long afterward, John S.D. Eisenhower interviewed him for the book The Bitter Woods, documenting the platoon's actions in detail. Eisenhower, who later served as U.S. ambassador to Belgium, hosted Book and several other veterans when they visited Lanzerath in December 1969. The village, reconstructed after the war, welcomed its American liberators warmly. One platoon member in particular, William James, born Takanicas, had suffered extensive combat injuries that required 37 operations. Despite repeated surgical interventions, he ultimately succumbed to complications from his wounds on June 22, 1977. James's story caught the attention of columnist Jack Anderson, who campaigned for him to receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. This effort brought national attention to the platoon for the first time and led to congressional hearings examining whether the entire unit deserved higher recognition. The hearings concluded with a recommendation that James be awarded the Medal of Honor. Congress went further, passing Public Law 96-145 on December 14, 1979, signed by President Jimmy Carter, which waived the usual time limitations for awards exclusively for members of the 394th Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon. While the Army and Air Force supported the Medal of Honor recommendation, the Marine Corps responsible for final approval declined to grant it, citing insufficient evidence of intrepidity. The decision remained controversial. Nonetheless, the congressional scrutiny prompted a comprehensive review of the platoon's wartime deeds. On October 26, 1981, nearly 36 years after the battle, the platoon finally received official recognition. 14 of the original 18 soldiers attended a ceremony at Fort Meade, Virginia, hosted by Secretary of the Army John O. Marsh. The awards were remarkable. 4, including Lieutenant Book, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. 5 earned the Silver Star. 9 were awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the entire platoon received the Presidential Unit Citation, recognizing their collective heroism. These honors made the 394th Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon the most decorated U.S. platoon of its size for a single engagement in World War II. For the veterans, the 1981 ceremony was profoundly meaningful. Book, by then a successful chiropractor, spoke emotionally about the men who had fought alongside him, especially those like Billy Queen, who had died in combat, and William James, whose injuries ultimately cost him his life. For decades, the platoon had believed their capture and the loss of their position was a failure. Now, they understood that their determined stand on a frozen ridge had been pivotal in shaping the outcome of one of the war's most critical battles. Years later, on May 12, 2005, the Belgian government honored the platoon with a monument at the Lanzerath Ridge site, commemorating their extraordinary courage and sacrifice. A modest yet solemn stone monument now stands as a tribute to those who fought on December 16, 1944, commemorating an extraordinary episode during the Battle of the Bulge. The inscription tells the story of 18 American soldiers who, despite being vastly outnumbered, held their ground against 500 German paratroopers. Their steadfast resistance delayed the advance of an entire SS Panzer division, providing critical time for Allied forces to organize defensive positions, and ultimately contributing to the success of the campaign. Over the years, the site has become a place of reverence for military historians, veterans, and the families of those who served. Every December 16th, small ceremonies are conducted to honor the memory of the battle, and Belgian students learn about the remarkable stand that occurred on the ridge overlooking their village. The legacy of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon has become an integral part of local historical identity. Lyle Book, the platoon's young lieutenant, lived long enough to witness the recognition of his unit's heroic action. After returning home, he built a life marked by family and professional achievement, practicing as a chiropractor from 1949 until his retirement in 1997. For decades, he remained largely silent about his wartime experiences. Only in his later years did he begin to share his memories with historians and researchers, maintaining close relationships with surviving members of his platoon. He regularly attended reunions and memorial events and frequently delivered eulogies for his fallen comrades, always emphasizing their bravery rather than his own. The honors eventually bestowed upon the platoon in 1981 were the culmination of years of persistent advocacy, extensive letter writing, and congressional testimonies led by Book, all aimed at ensuring his men received the recognition they deserved. On December 2, 2016, Lyle Book passed away at age 92, just shy of his 93rd birthday. He was the last surviving officer of the platoon. His death was noted nationwide, including in military journals and major newspapers such as the New York Times, which highlighted his role in one of World War II's most extraordinary defensive efforts. Veterans groups paid tribute to him, and the surviving members of the 99th Infantry Division held memorial services. He was laid to rest with full military honors, remembered as a leader who devoted his final decades to celebrating the valor of those he commanded. The stand at Lanzerath Ridge is recognized as one of the most remarkable small unit actions in American military history. 18 soldiers, under the command of a 20-year-old lieutenant, faced a force of 500 enemy troops for nearly an entire day. They inflicted 92 confirmed casualties while suffering only 1 fatality and 14 wounded before ultimately being overwhelmed. More importantly, their resistance delayed the advance of the German 6th Panzer Army by 18 critical hours during the opening phase of Germany's last major offensive in the West. This delay provided Allied commanders with the opportunity to reinforce threatened sectors and establish defensive positions that would eventually contain and repel the German assault. The battle's impact can be measured in straightforward terms. The German timetable required exact adherence. The spearhead, commanded by Kampfgruppe Peiper, was expected to reach the Moose River on December 16. Instead, it was held up for a full day by a small platoon that, from the enemy's perspective, seemed much larger. When Peiper finally resumed movement on the morning of December 17, he was already 18 hours behind schedule, unable to recover lost time. The delay allowed American forces to secure critical supplies, destroy bridges, and launch air support that would later strike German positions. Reinforcements reached blocking positions before German troops could break through, ensuring that strategic points across the front were defended, including positions on Elsenborn Ridge, St. Vith, and areas covered by the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Without the time bought by the small unit at Lanzerath, the course of the Battle of the Bulge could have been far more costly in both lives and resources. The story of Buch's platoon illustrates core military principles: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, disciplined execution of orders, and the strategic significance of small units. These young men chose to hold their ground despite being heavily outnumbered, fought with remarkable efficiency, and inflicted disproportionate damage on the enemy. They maintained cohesion under extreme pressure and surrendered honorably only when resistance was no longer possible. The episode also highlights the importance of leadership at the small unit level. Lieutenant Buch, only 20 years old and commanding men often older than himself, skillfully employed terrain, coordinated his troops' fire, and ensured that intelligence was communicated to higher command. His tactical judgment and ability to inspire obedience and discipline proved decisive in a situation that might have otherwise been catastrophic. Ultimately, the defense of Lanzerath Ridge stands as a testament to the profound effect that a small, determined group can have on the larger course of a campaign. The valor of 18 men, under the guidance of a young and capable officer, created a ripple effect that contributed significantly to the Allied victory in one of World War II's most critical battles. During the intense fighting, the platoon leader demonstrated remarkable bravery, moving from one position to another under heavy fire, inspiring those under his command to continue resisting. Even after sustaining injuries and being taken prisoner, his immediate concern remained the welfare of his soldiers. The platoon itself displayed exceptional proficiency. Selected for reconnaissance and intelligence roles due to their superior shooting and tactical abilities, the men exhibited extraordinary control over their weapons. Every burst from their machine guns, every rifle shot was deliberate and precise, showing no signs of panic or wastefulness. Despite enduring artillery barrages, witnessing the deaths of comrades like Billy Queen, suffering injuries themselves, and facing overwhelming numbers without any hope of reinforcement, they held their ground steadfastly. The level of discipline and composure these soldiers maintained was extraordinary, especially considering their inexperience. The 99th Infantry Division had recently arrived in Europe and had not yet been tested in combat. Nevertheless, in the critical moment, these young men performed with the skill and coordination expected of seasoned veterans. Their opponents, however, were not lacking in capability. The German 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, part of the elite 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, consisted of paratroopers with extensive combat experience. They had significant numerical superiority, approximately 28-1, and were supported by artillery and mortars. Under typical circumstances, they should have overrun the American positions in their initial assault. That they failed to do so for nearly a full day underscores both the effectiveness of the defenders and the tactical advantage provided by well-prepared positions manned by disciplined troops. The German soldiers exhibited courage in continuing repeated attacks despite suffering heavy losses. Their battalion commander displayed sound tactical judgment, eventually shifting to flank maneuvers rather than persisting with futile frontal assaults. By the time the Americans were finally overcome, the German unit had sustained losses that rendered it largely ineffective as a fighting force. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge also highlighted the impact of the fog of war. American commanders had no clear understanding of the platoon's actions as communication lines had been severed. The men fought in isolation, unaware that their resistance was producing significant strategic effects. When the position was finally lost and they were captured, Lieutenant Bork felt personally defeated, believing the mission had failed. This perception haunted him for decades. German commanders likewise operated with incomplete intelligence. The battalion leader assumed he was facing a much larger force, likely a full company equipped with heavy weapons. This overestimation led him to adopt cautious tactics and suspend his advance after dark. The German High Command lacked real-time awareness of why their schedule was unraveling. Only post-war historical analysis, comparing records from both sides, could reveal the full sequence of events. Treatment of the captured Americans by their German captors was generally in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Wounded soldiers received medical attention in aid stations established in local homes before being transported to the rear, a stark contrast to the Malmö massacre the following day, where SS elements under Camp Gruppe Piper executed American prisoners. This discrepancy illustrates that violations of the laws of war were not systematic across the German military, but often depended on the leadership and ethical standards of individual units. The paratroopers who captured Buch's platoon adhered to military regulations, while Piper's SS forces committed one of the most infamous atrocities of the conflict. Life as prisoners of war was brutal. The men were packed into cattle cars without food or water, forced to witness deaths from exposure and dehydration, and confined for months in overcrowded, unsanitary camps with insufficient nutrition and medical care. Many suffered life-threatening conditions from both combat wounds and harsh captivity. When liberation finally came in April 1945, the survivors were emaciated, weakened, and psychologically scarred. Some, like William James, endured years of surgical procedures to treat injuries sustained in battle, ultimately succumbing to complications decades later. The physical and mental toll of this experience left lasting marks on the men, highlighting the profound human cost of even a short but intense engagement. The men of this platoon endured immense hardship in the line of duty. Their bravery went largely unnoticed for decades, highlighting a deeper flaw within the system that governs military honors. During the chaos of battle, particularly in the confusion that marked the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge, many acts of exceptional courage were overlooked. Units that were overrun, captured, or otherwise lost in the turmoil often saw their accomplishments fade into obscurity. It was not until 36 years later that Lieutenant Buch's platoon finally received the recognition it deserved, a delay that underscores the inefficiency and limitations of the awards process. Only through Buch's relentless advocacy, investigative reporting by journalists such as Jack Anderson, congressional inquiries, and ultimately special legislation did these veterans obtain the formal acknowledgement that had been due to them since 1944. This raises a poignant question. How many other acts of valor were never recorded, never acknowledged, and quietly vanished into history? The engagement at Lanzerath Ridge has since become a subject of extensive historical analysis. Numerous books, articles, and documentaries have examined the battle, with Alex Kershaw's The Longest Winter providing the most thorough account, bringing the story to widespread public attention. Kershaw's work, which reached bestseller status on the New York Times list, introduced new generations to the extraordinary efforts of 18 soldiers whose actions, though small in scale, had a significant impact on the course of the campaign. Military scholars continue to reference Lanzerath Ridge as a prime example of effective defensive tactics executed by a small unit. The platoon stand is now incorporated into military education, demonstrating critical lessons in leadership, initiative, and the influence that a single well-trained group can exert on broader operations. The enduring principles observed in this battle remain relevant today. Soldiers capable of independent action when communication fails, junior officers empowered to make tactical decisions, the strategic advantage of prepared defensive positions, the multiplying effect of accurate fire and effective terrain utilization, and the extraordinary courage required to hold against overwhelming odds. These lessons transcend eras and technology. They were crucial in 1944 and continue to inform modern military doctrine. The human dimension of the battle is equally compelling. These were ordinary young Americans, not larger-than-life warriors. Lieutenant Buch had joined the Army at 14 during the Depression to support his family, while many of his men were former college students drafted into service. They came from diverse backgrounds, united by national service. When confronted with an extraordinary situation, their performance stemmed not from innate heroism, but from disciplined training, competent leadership, and loyalty to their comrades. The intense bonds forged under fire would endure for the rest of their lives. Members of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon maintained lifelong connections, holding reunions, exchanging letters, and supporting one another through the challenges of post-war life. The Belgian villagers who witnessed the platoon's defense remembered their actions for decades. Even long after the war, local residents stayed in touch with the veterans, sending letters and arranging visits, ensuring that their sacrifice was not forgotten. In 2005, when a monument was dedicated at Lanzerath, multiple generations of Belgian families attended, honoring the Americans who had fought to protect their village. This enduring connection between liberators and the liberated reflects one of World War II's lasting legacies. The Americans who fought in Europe were remembered not as conquerors but as protectors, and their deeds remain deeply valued by those they freed. Lanzerath Ridge illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare. Victory is not determined solely by major battles or famous commanders. It is often shaped by countless small-scale actions, many executed by units whose names never achieve widespread recognition. 18 soldiers holding a ridge for a single day, a squad defending a bridge for an hour, a platoon securing a crossroads overnight. These seemingly minor engagements collectively influence the outcomes of larger campaigns. The soldiers involved frequently have no awareness of the strategic significance of their actions. They act out of duty, following orders and supporting their peers. Yet in doing so, they alter the course of history. Lieutenant Book and his men never sought fame. They were assigned an almost impossible mission and carried it out to the utmost of their ability. In standing firm as long as they could, they accomplished something extraordinary. Though ultimately overwhelmed, their steadfastness demonstrated the profound impact that courage, skill, and teamwork can have in the crucible of combat. During a critical moment in World War II, a small platoon of American soldiers managed to inflict 92 casualties on the German forces while delaying their advance by 18 hours, an achievement that stands as one of the most distinguished acts by a small unit in USC military history. This action illustrated that bravery, tactical skill, and decisive leadership at the unit level can create effects that resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield. It proved that ordinary Americans, when well-trained and effectively commanded, are capable of accomplishments that exceed expectation. Even in circumstances that might traditionally be considered defeat, surrounded by the enemy, facing capture, or unable to achieve conventional objectives, this platoon demonstrated that a unit could achieve a meaningful form of victory. Their contribution directly supported the larger mission, showing that courage and determination can shape outcomes in ways that statistics alone might not reveal. As time passes and the veterans of the Second World War pass from memory, it becomes increasingly crucial to preserve their accounts. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge is more than a case study in military maneuvering or strategic consequence. It is a testament to human resilience. Young men stood their ground when retreat might have been safer. They engaged in combat when surrender could have spared them danger, and when taken prisoner, they endured hardship with steadfastness and dignity. Preserving this story allows successive generations to grasp the cost of freedom, the sacrifices behind victory, and the obligations owed to those who came before. Every year on December 16th, ceremonies at the Lanzerath Ridge Monument honor these soldiers. Wreaths are placed, speeches delivered, and the names of each member of the platoon read aloud. Belgian students are educated about the events that unfolded on the frozen ridge decades ago. American veterans and military personnel attend to pay tribute, keeping the act of remembrance alive and ensuring that the sacrifice is neither forgotten nor diminished. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment exemplifies how a small group can leave a lasting mark on history. 18 men significantly disrupted a German offensive, buying time that contributed to the ultimate Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. This, in turn, accelerated the end of the war, preserved countless lives, and safeguarded the freedom of Western Europe. The line connecting the frozen ridge in Belgium to the world as we experience it today is direct. The liberty and peace we enjoy were secured by the courage of those soldiers. Lieutenant Lyle Book and his men achieved what few could have imagined on that December day in 1944. They held their assigned position for as long as it was humanly possible, caused enemy losses far exceeding their own numbers, and obstructed a major German advance at a pivotal moment. Despite being heavily outnumbered, isolated from support, and facing some of Germany's elite troops, they stood firm and fought with determination and expertise. Their actions deserve to be remembered alongside the most celebrated battles and heroes of World War II.